So let's talk about presidents. No, not U.S. presidents or CEOs or whatever. Well, maybe CEOs. Let's talk about the president of the United States Soccer Federation, which is Sunil Gulati. Now, Sunil Gulati is an important person. He's an economist who runs the U.S. Soccer Federation the best he knows how, which isn't very good. Now, the question arises, what is his primary responsibility? Is his responsibility to ensure that the United States national team performs to its maximum potential, whatever the maximum potential it must be, or whether it's more important that a lot of people kick soccer around in the playgrounds on weekends, sort of a catch softball for everybody. Catch ball, you catch, you throw the ball, and a little dog gets it. So, of course, in this instance, we're going to talk about the United States men's national soccer team and Sunil Gulati's responsibility in guiding to the best possible results. And so, now let's talk about who he is. He's an economics professor. He teaches at Columbia. He's not a CEO. His position is not paid. It's free. So there is a legitimate question of how much power Gulati actually has. Does he have the power to hire the person he wants? Does he have the power to fire the person he doesn't want? Or is it done outside of him? Maybe he has the power to hire but not to fire, or maybe his decisions are heavily influenced by people we don't know, namely Don Garber, whom we really don't know because Don Garber isn't responsible to anybody outside of MLS. And he's responsible to MLS owners, about which later. So, Gulati's career is kind of interesting. He sort of came up the ranks working for Bob Kraft in New England, or Boston, and sort of worked for his organization. But let's go back to 2006. In 2006, Sunil Gulati decides to fire Bruce Arena when the United States finishes last in its group, although it was a tough group. It was a group of death, but they finished with 1 point, dead last in the group, one of the worst performances ever, so Arena, of course, needed to go. And to replace him, Sunil Gulati really wanted Jurgen Klinsmann, which was kind of obvious. First of all, Jurgen Klinsmann was coming a very impressive performance where Germany took 3rd place in 2006 World Cup. Second of all, he was living in Orange County, which wasn't far away from the U.S. Soccer Center, and he was sort of tuned into the whole U.S. Soccer scene, sort of working out informally, playing informally in pickup leagues around Southern California. So Jurgen Klinsmann was candidate number 1. They come over, they talk. Klinsmann asked for full power with youth soccer. That makes perfect sense. Today somebody's playing for U20s. A year later, he's capped by the senior squad. You want to be able to control the progress. But United States Soccer Federation has a nice thing going, whether it's a good old boys network, and to sort of give each other jobs just for the hell of it, regardless of the performance. And so Gulati and Klinsmann do not come to a deal. At that point, Bob Bradley. Now, Bob Bradley just happens to live in the same place where Jurgen Klinsmann lived, or just south of it, in Southern California, to where Klinsmann lived in a large mansion somewhere in Laguna Niguel or whatever, they lived in Newport Beach. Bob Bradley apparently lived in the apartment that he shared with Preki. Bob Bradley was sort of was named as an interim manager in the winter of 2007, and he was allowed to keep his job. And this reminds me of a great old Gary Shandling joke. Now, I was a big fan of Gary Shandling, the late Gary Shandling. Met him once, thought he was a really funny guy, about as funny person in live, just talking to him as I've ever seen. So Gary Shandling has this joke. He says, I go to a newsstand and, try to buy a good, magazine before I go on a flight. I said, do you have the copy of The Nation? I said, no, don't have the copy. We're out of stock. Well, how about the National Review? No, we don't have the National Review, out of stock. So he thinks about it for a moment and says, okay, just give me a copy of Hustler. Well, if Jurgen Klinsmann was high aspiration, The Nation, the National Review, then Bob Bradley was nobody. Bob Bradley really had no international credit, no international resume. And it's what happens. where a job has no written description. Now, if you look at a wanted help in the newspapers, it always says what kind of requirements are needed for a particular job. They need to have 10 years of experience, 20 years of experience. They need to have, manage people, know computers, whatever, have a professional degree. There are all sorts of requirements for any given job. The United States soccer coach, the job of a head soccer coach, it had no description. It could be Jürgen Klinsmann, who just took a very talented team to the 3rd place in the World Cup, or it could Bob Bradley, who's managing a bunch of riffraff at Chivas USA, which was a crappy team then, was even crappier team later, and eventually fell apart and now was kicked out and got replaced. So what are the requirements? What are the requirements for the head of the United Soccer Federation? Well, we don't know that. So it's kind of an old boys crony network. Old guys get hired, bad guys get replaced, or so we think, because we don't know. The same people are running around in the same power circles. And we don't know what their responsibilities are. Now, let's go back to Bradley. So when Sunil Gulati hired Bob Bradley was, to me, was a nobody. He was an MLS coach, where MLS being just a single A, maybe at best a double A quality league, if you take that, EPL is a major league, and some smaller European leagues are triple A. So United States was a single A, maybe at best a double A team at the time. Poor team, low salaries, poorly coached from left to right, from one sideline to another. But Bob Bradley was there, and the old line knows, the 90% of success is just showing up. So Bob Bradley showed up, took the job. And so one looks at Bob Bradley's career, one has to think, well, they didn't do that badly. I mean, they won the 2007 Gold Cup. They didn't do too well in the subsequent Gold Cups. I mean, they lost to Mexico by a combined score of 2-9. In other words, the score 2, they allowed 9. That's not a great performance by Bob Bradley. Nonetheless, this soldiered on. And so one looked at what Bob Bradley was doing with the United States. One could say, they're not doing that badly. But as I mentioned in the previous post, if you look at the number of players that were in their prime and in European leagues in 2010, which was Bob's only World Cup, he had 16 players in their prime playing in decent European leagues. Well, some were playing in smaller leagues, some were playing in Mexico. But that was the best U.S. roster ever from that point of view, if you believe so, and I do. And that gives a different perspective. In other words, when you evaluate a coach, you always evaluate versus the talent. Now, last year, a guy named Marco Silva took over took over Hull City, which was in the last place, had a horrible record. He took over the team, they made some changes, and they actually were for a while in position to stay, to avoid relegation. Eventually lost last couple of matches, and Hull City went down. But considering the quality of talent on hand, Marco Silva was judged to have done a pretty good job. So this year, or following the Hull City's relegation, he was hired by Watford, who didn't think that their coach, Mazzari, did a good job. And so they hired Marco Silva because they thought he did a good job with what he had. And now Watford is in 4th place, which, I know it's early in the season and unlikely to stay up there, but so far, Marco Silva done a tremendous job. He's a young Portuguese coach who had a pretty good resume going in. Well, now, of course, he's going to be a candidate for even bigger jobs. So let's look at Bob Bradley's career with that perspective. Did Bob Bradley do well, given the players he had on hand? And I thought that for a while he was doing poorly, but then he had his moments. He was with the United States for over 4 years. So he had moments where they did pretty well. Obviously, they beat Spain, which, they got outshot 28-5. But they beat Spain. But at the end, they were going down, down, down. And that's the danger of of hiring a coach with, indefinite type of a qualification, or a known type of qualification, or you sort of hope that he can do well, but you don't know if he can do well. Well, when Bob Bradley went to Swansea, well, of course, he went to Egypt, and they got destroyed, and they got knocked out of every tournament. Now they're in the World Cup. But when Bob Bradley went to Swansea, let's skip forward, he was shown to be utterly incompetent. So now you look back at those teams and say, sure, they didn't do too badly under Bob, but they could have done perhaps a lot better. Maybe they could have won every Gold Cup. Maybe they could have gone to the semifinal or quarterfinal at least. Could have beaten Ghana. I mean, who knows? Maybe if Bob Bradley didn't play Michael Bradley and played Maurice Edu and Stu Holden in central midfield, they wouldn't allow those 2 goals. Maybe if he was more organized in the back, they could have kept clean sheet against Ghana. And it's possible. We don't know. This is one of those, things that we have no ability to discern, no ability to predict. Just like with Jurgen Klinsmann when he got fired, the team lost 4-0. There was a reason enough to fire Jurgen Klinsmann. But we don't know whether he could have righted the ship and everything would have turned out okay, or whether Klinsmann done as well as Bruce Arena, which is nothing. I mean, didn't manage to qualify the team. And so we come to the situation where we now have to, we don't have to, but we're fans, we want to. The United States Soccer Federation has to come up with a certain standard of whom they're going to hire as their head coach. So the first 2 names, and let's go back to Nation, National Review, or The Hustler. 1 name or 2 names bandied about from overseas were Laurent Blanc, and my French accent is impeccable, and Sam Allardyce, or Allardyce, no, he's English or Scottish or something, Welsh. So Allardyce was mostly known for having taken a really crappy Bolton team and keeping it in the top 10 for most of his reign, or at least last half of his reign, and also doing pretty well with Crystal Palace and Sunderland, saving them from relegation. And then he got fired twice from Newcastle and Blackburn, and both of those teams got relegated. So he obviously seemed to outperform the talent on hand, which is important. Now, Laurent Blanc is a little different. Obviously, he was a great player with France and Manchester United and some other French clubs, Italian clubs maybe. And he coached at a really high level. I mean, he coached France and he coached Paris Saint-Germain. When you coach at those levels, when you coach high in the Champions League, you're obviously coaching against the elite players and elite coaches. So maybe he's not outwitted every other coach, but he was competent enough to be on that level. So those 2 names I can tolerate. I'll prefer Blanc probably over Allardyce. Nonetheless, I can tolerate those names. Let me talk about Peter Vermees. Now, what has Peter Vermees done? I mean, he got destroyed by Cruz Azul 5-1. That's his qualifications. Oh, he's American. Well, because, the soccer ball is American. And when you play soccer, Americans play other Americans, unless they go to Trinidad and Tobago when they play Central Americans. And so, once again, we come this full circle. What are the qualifications that are required to be a head coach of the United States soccer team? And I fear that Sunil Gulati doesn't know, or he's uncertain, or he has no clue. He has no clue what he is doing. And does he have to go? Or should they form some sort of a committee that would be in charge of coaching hire and allow Gulati to handle everything else in terms of potential negotiation and hosting the World Cup and so forth? Maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. But by the way, ESPN mentioned Landon Donovan. I mean, that was funny. I laugh heartily.